Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I'm James, a composer based on the south coast of the UK, and it's great to have you along. I'm going to be doing lots more things. Time now allows me to talk a little bit more about what I do. I've been kind of flat out working and doing family stuff for a couple of years, so people before used to see track breakdowns and all kinds of stuff from me on stuff I was doing. It kind of had to stop for a while, but it's back, so please drop a like and subscribe. So now that that's done, today we're going to dive into actually a production music track that got picked up in an album that got picked up for publishers. I'm going to kind of talk about the context of it, go into the harmony, the instrumentation, the structure of it, and how it worked. I'm going to do another video about the kind of production and mixing side of it, because that's a whole nother kettle of fish. So let's dive in and talk about the context. Okay, so a while back now, I was on Instagram like I am a lot. I like working on Instagram, talking to other creative people, listening to their work, seeing what they've been up to. I find it a really nice tool to communicate with and now to collaborate with, because a composer that came up on my profile that I was following anyway, Steve Matthew Carter, who, by the way, absolutely stand-up guy. Go listen to his work. He's done some great production music stuff that's used all over the place. He's done some film scores and stuff recently that are incredible. And he's the kind of person who he just gives without thinking. And when he put out a message saying he was looking for new people to collaborate with, at that time, I'd heard what he was doing, and it was really different to what I was doing. And I thought, actually, maybe that makes us a good fit. And I think we both agreed that made us a good fit, because we do different things and we can up each other's games in kind of different areas and bring something different. So Steve, having more experience in the kind of production music world, came up with this kind of concept for this album and these ideas, and then we kind of went from there and wrote on it, and it got picked up by the music supervisors. So massively grateful to those guys for picking it up. I'll stick a link down in the description if you want to hear the whole album. But essentially, it's basically an album of serious drama lead tracks. So everything from your staccato-led strings to more delicate things, stuff like politics, business empire, corporate, statecraft, power, betrayal, corruption, crime, espionage. There's lots of stuff in there that you could do with this, and it was a really, really exciting project to work on. I've worked on a few things with Steve, and I'd love to work with him again. So now that we've kind of got the context out of the way, what would be really great now is we could just dive in and start digging into the track itself. Okay, so I've got the track up here. I'm just going to ping myself actually out the way over here for a second, because I want to just be able to zoom just a little bit more to show you just the overall structure. So briefly, I like to work in Cubase. I've done work in Logic. Cubase works for me. We're not getting into a debate about DAWs now. That's just crazy. But Cubase works for me, so that's why I've used it. I've used it a lot of times. And you can see here, essentially, this particular one, it comes to this, is basically a piano and strings cue. And you can see I've got everything kind of laid out here. So this isn't necessarily how I would label it to deliver it. I think it was labeled differently for delivery. But this is how it's set up. So I've got my long strings in a folder up here. Got my short strings in a folder down here. I don't have any tune percussion or orchestral percussion. And then I've got my keys here. And I like to lay my keys out in this way. I have a piano that's going to be my piano sitting in center. I've got my piano that's kind of my left hand. And then I've got stuff that my right hand might do. And then in terms of my routing and where stuff's going to, I have a strings long bus, strings short bus, and a keys bus. And then effects wise, I've got my reverbs going into that. So it's just a really basic setup. And here's what we've got. So before I dive in anymore and start unpicking everything else, if you want to listen to the full track, I'll put a link in the description now, and you can go hear the full thing. But the idea of this one is it's going to build from start to finish. So the way it started was with a chord sequence. And it's a chord sequence that features 8 chords. Okay. So I'm going to play that 8 chord sequence for you now so you can just hear that. So there you go. There's that chord sequence. And what I'll do, we'll just go over the main chords that we got there and then a couple of changes that take place. So we're working in B minor here. I quite like working in B minor. So B minor is where we start. We then jump to an F sharp major chord, then back to B minor. Then we go to an A major chord. Then we go off and start going in a bit of a different direction as it builds later on. We go to an E minor chord, but eventually it's got a G in the bass. And then we go to an E minor with a sharpened 6th chord to add some colour. So that's a normal E minor chord, but it's then got a C sharp stuck in there. I absolutely love that chord. It's one of my favourites. If you listen to any of my music, it's smattered in there all over the place. Then we jump back to B minor, and then we finish to allow us to drop back round on another F sharp major chord. Now, this kind of thing, I guess for me, I like chord sequences like this because my kind of major thing I studied at university was piano works of kind of Eastern European composers like Chopin, Scriabin, Rachmaninoff, those kind of big romantic and more modern giants. This kind of colourful harmony mixed in with these big, bold kind of deep notes and chords over the top. And the first thing I did when I got these chords was rather than have them played as just sort of block static chords, was inject a small amount of movement into the piano. So you can see that here, where we've got this kind of big clanging root note comes in, and then a beat later we then have the chord. And the other thing that I've done here is leave a pedal note in. So this B drags behind as we drop to F sharp major in this first bar. So we get the first one, this root chord that we're expecting, this B minor, and then we're kind of held in that as we get the 5th over the top. Let's just hear that for a second. So it's kind of creating this air mysterious. We don't quite know where we're going early on as this develops. And exactly the same thing with the next ones. And later on in the second half of the chord sequence, you can see again, I want to change it up. I don't want my chord sequence to just be blocky. I want it to feel like it is something that some emotion could be put into. So I've put a little bit of movement up here amongst my chord when we get to this E minor one. Almost like a little bit of a melody, to hint at a melody for a second where we get this movement down from this B, or rather this E, down to the B, and then up to the C sharp that gives the colour in the second half. So let's just hear that. So we get that E minor chord that's pivoting not on its root note, and then it slams in to bring that C sharp, which I absolutely love. Let's just hear that for a second. And in there, it's not too restrictive. I haven't put too much emphasis on it being there, on it holding. And then we get back to where we were. And that's essentially where we're at. And as we go, that piano part is going to develop throughout the piece as we go until we get to this final section. So in our first section, I guess you could say, now that we've talked about the harmony, it's kind of split into 3 parts to allow it to build. And quite often when I'm writing things like this that I know are going to build, and I've just done another project that was all about specifically builds, every track had to build, I like to start quite often at the biggest end that I'm going to have. I like to start, and you'll often see, not in this one, I could show you another one that has at the beginning, I just have a massive block of stuff. And what I'll do is I'll go write all these layers and parts. I'll write the biggest part and see how everything's going to interconnect and interweave. Then I'll start unpicking it and putting it into some sort of structure of how that's going to work. With this one, it was slightly different because I had the harmonic idea first. So once I had the chords, I then went in, worked out what my layers are going to be. So let's jump into how the strings at the beginning as well, and what they're going to do. So in terms of the library, particularly for strings, that I've chosen to work with for the most part, they're very sort of dry libraries. They don't really come with reverb or much on them. They're very dry. So in the basses here, if I bring my window back, in the basses here, and of course it's gone onto my other screen, I'm using Spitfire Studio Strings Legato, very kind of dry library. And then for my individual instruments, I'm using the Cremona Quartet from Native Instruments. For stuff like this, where if I was being really cinematic and this was for a film, I'd probably splosh reverb all over this. I'd use much bigger string sections, but we wanted quite a small feel to this. So this is piano and really double quartet, effectively. There's a few things that cheat at that. And I mean, these are really great sounding. You've got two different violins, which is nice. So I'm not doubling this. I've got the Stradivari violin. I've got the Canaria violin on another one for violin 2. And you see I've got them separated out in articulations here. So you could key switch. I don't like to key switch. I like to keep everything separate so I can control various things. That's just the way I like to work. You can work however you like. And let's just dive in. So at the beginning, we've got the cello, the viola, and violin 2. And all they're essentially doing is taking our chord sequence that we have, and they're just putting some movement into it. So the other important thing that I have on all of these as well is I have played around with the modulation to give it a sense of realism. Not too much realism, but to make it feel like it's not a computer that's playing this. There's a human element to it. So let's just hear this. So what's going to happen, okay, so on this first beat, we get our piano root note. The second beat, we get the piano chord. And then on the very last beat of the first bar, we get some string movement. And it brings it to life a little bit. Rather than just static chords, we get something interesting going on. So let's just hear the strings on their own for a second. And you can kind of hear that modulation. You can see it here. It's going to build up and build out. And just something really quick here. When I first started out, I didn't know this, so I'll mention this really quickly. You'll see on here that my MIDI data here, it overlaps ever so slightly, and some people are like, oh, you haven't tidied it. But actually, I've done it deliberately. A lot of samples, in order to trigger the switch in Legato, you need to have an overtag. I didn't realize this at the beginning when I started writing with MIDI instruments. It's one of the reasons that my pieces at the beginning didn't sound particularly professional. So just bear that in mind. Look at what your sample library needs you to do. Have a little bit of overhang if it's Legato. So that's how we're getting interest. Let's just very quickly hear that all together so we can hear that piano come in, drop its root note, drop its bass note, drop its chord, and then the string movement over the top. Let's just listen to that for a second. So really, really simple open opening, but there's a little bit of movement. There's a little bit of interest. So one thing that I will quickly mention as well is I talked about just the legato key. So I'm going to dive into the mix window for a second because you can see some of the panning I've done. And I've done a separate video where I go in depth in panning from a long time ago, but it's crazy. It's one of my most watched videos on the channel. It's quite a while old. I'll pop that in a box or in the description if you want to know more about panning. But it really does, particularly to strings when it's quite isolated, spreading your strings out in this kind of classic sort of quartet arrangement really just lifts the sound a little bit. So if you want to know more about that, go have a look. But essentially, I've got my violin ones further over to the left as they be sat there. They're my sort of violin 2s there. Now, normally in a quartet, you might have your cello next and the viola on the other end. I've decided to keep my viola almost at the center and actually my cello over to the right hand side, and then when it comes in later on, my bass is down the center. And you can see for all my different parts, I've replicated that in my strings. So that's the basic harmony, that's the basic setup. It all folds around these simple chords, slow moving legato kind of chords. So how does it start to build? So we just heard the first section there, very still, very open. We then get to a repeat of that, but what we're going to do is we're going to get into the more movement in the piano chords. Rather than just having the 4 chords, we're going to have the full 8 this time. And that's what happens. Then the next time we hear it, that's when it starts to get interesting. We then get these short strings, and you can see I've played around with the velocity. So velocity is how kind of heavy you hit the keys, and that triggers a different kind of sound within this sample library. So I just want these to be quite light. So let's just hear these little light. Not too much at all, not very intrusive. Little bit of rhythm, little bit of movement behind what's going on. So you've got that there, and then you just heard the other bits singing on. So how does that work all together? We get this kind of feel. So those short strings then, where there's nothing before, where we just had that piano movement, they fill that gap. So what this is doing is it's allowing all these parts to kind of shine. And that's one of the really important fundamental things. And I think there's a couple of things that people forget is your music, particularly in production, doesn't have to be complicated. Quite often, depending on how it's going to be used, it could be more in the background. Yep, it could get used on a trailer and be front and center of everything that's happening. But it could be being used in something more subtle that's kind of going on. So you don't necessarily want it to be too much. But likewise, the arrangement that you use is really important. Lots of people try and solve problems in kind of mixing process and chuck in plugins at everything. And I've been guilty of that at the beginning, and I still am guilty of it sometimes. Sometimes you have to take a step back and just look at your actual arrangement and say, as just a piece of music in its own right, without any plugins or anything turned on, does this arrangement work? Does it work? Is there stuff that is blocking other things from being heard? Have I allowed enough space between layers and things that are going on? Now, in this one, I've deliberately put harmony quite close together. So then we get to another sort of section, and we really start to bring in now our shorter strings. So you can see we've got the kind of patterns from before, but we've got something a little bit lower down now, more at the bass end, that's doing a bit more movement. So let's just hear now what the short strings are going to do. Okay, so we've got more movement now. And again, what I've kind of done is taken, if we dive back in, I've taken the space kind of between these. So some of the notes that I had before are now being accented by those lower strings, but there's also hits from them in those gaps. So we get this nice sort of different little moments around a string section where we get a little bit of rhythm, a little bit of a knock-on effect. Now, in terms of articulations, I'm using, for my short basses at this time, I'm using pizzicato, again, studio string. They're there. For my violin ones, I'm using a spiccato. For my violin twos, I'm using a sottile single, and then violin twos later on, there's also some spiccato. Same violas, sottile detached, and same in the cellos. So we're getting very low down, not so much still. Don't want it to be low down. And then we still have our sort of original quartet, if you like, doing the long strings on top. So let's just have a quick, we listen to what that sounds like. yeah, then we start getting some interesting stuff. So another little build within a sort of section here. So we kept that. Then on top of our short strings, we've then got this actual pattern that's going on its own in the second violins. I love to write little kind of almost arpeggiated parts like this for two reasons. I love hearing this sustained, almost kind of pedal notes that appear at the bottom of these, but I also love that second of silence that you get in between. So this gap kind of at the end of this first down up before the next one. I really like how that extends it. And you can see here, I've taken some care with my velocities. I've played this in by hand rather than sat and program it, and then I've done a little bit of work on the velocities to get a wee bit more of a realistic sound. I haven't just hit everything the same. That way we're triggering some slightly different samples for some variations, getting a little bit more realism. So that cuts in over the top, and at that point we've also then got doubling what those legato strings were doing. Let's just pull the pedal down here. So we've got our instead of having our normal piano chords that come in as they were after a beat and were sort of static, the piano is now going to mirror what the strings were doing, but it's going to mirror it an octave higher. So we get something new piquing our interest just underneath. So for that first half of that new section, piano is it's in the background, it's in texture. Then it comes to the fore, doubling what the strings are doing at an octave higher. So let's just hear that as this sort of arpeggiated pattern comes in, and the piano starts doing some movement over the top as well. Okay, so that's that. We're building, and then we're going to get to this final section. Now, I personally, when I'm writing production music, I like to leave the silences in. I like to have silences between sections. For two reasons. I often like to have a big kickstart into the next session, but also having worked in films and worked with some editors and people who are selecting sounds, they often talk about sometimes it's just easier for them to have a section they know is going to finish, so they can line it up with exactly what they want to line it up with. It's just the way I like to work. You don't have to do it that way. There's very successful pieces that don't have gaps in. So we then get to the final section. You can see from the structure, as we've kind of gone through, we have added stuff. But it's not just been about adding stuff and more instruments to it. We've changed, as you can see, what we've done, and we've introduced new parts, and there's reasons that we've done that until we've got to this final section. So we've got a couple of new sort of shorter arpeggiated movements in the short strings now. So we've got this one. And we've got that going on. So when we now put our shorter strings together, we've got sort of similar chords from before, our pattern that was going on, but now we've got a couple of people. We've got the arpeggiated pattern before and this part over the top. Following that original harmony. So we've got downs, we've got up and downs, and then we've got a static. So that on its own, when you listen to that works. This is why when I was talking about earlier about having an arrangement that works, there's a lot going on there, and you can see from the MIDI kind of piano roll here, there is a lot of crossover. But because the time has been taken to adjust velocities and think about the rhythms, it actually works together, and if you listen to it, you can pick out the individual parts. And for me, that's the sign I feel that I'm onto the right track. Can I pick out this individual part still. If I'm listening back to it and I can't distinguish my violas from my cellos or my first violins from my second violins, unless I'm not supposed to, then I need to go back and look at what I've created, because there's potentially a problem there. There's potentially an issue. So that's our short strings. One of my favorite bits in the strings is finally the kind of legato longer strings get to do something different. This is a build, and what I wanted to do for this, let's just pull this velocity down and let's just zoom out a touch so you can see at the start of this section we've got what we had before, but we've now got the basses doubling the kind of piano bass notes with their legato now. So a little bit heavier on the bass now to sort of ground what we're doing. We've still got our moving chords before until we get to this ending. We're almost hinting at it, but it's this rise at the end that I really, really love. Just to go for this final, what's going to happen, what's going to happen, what's going to happen. We're going up instead of always, we've been falling. Every time our chords come in, we've been falling. This time at the end, for a final variations phase, we're going to rise. So let's just listen to the long strings on their own for this part. So instead of them just doing the chordal harmony that they were doing before at the end there, they actually get a melody, and that's doubled in a piano part that's in there as well. Because we've got the piano doing the traditional string chords, and then the kind of icing on the cake is in the piano part. But let's just listen to how that works, all the kind of strings into this section together for a second. And then we've got our final long. So again, if you want to dive into that string part, you can pick out the individual things. And the only thing that I had to be aware of here is when we get that melody, because the strings are doing that melody, we have to have those chords in the piano to get our harmony underneath. So let's come away from the strings for a second. Let's talk about what the piano does. The piano hasn't really changed a massive amount since we looked at it earlier. There's just a couple of new things added. So we've got the doubling of part of the string melody here that's added to the piano. With lots of pedal and it just lingering on far longer than it should. And then the other thing that we've gone big for in the piano here is these huge up-down arpeggios that, again, I think it's harking back to this kind of big, kind of almost Rachmaninoff romantic composer, big up-down, massive sort of piano concerto style things added this in the end. So if we hear these, there you go. So that's those. They're there. And the other thing that I've done this time is I've really gone to town, gone a lot more to town on the kind of bass here in the piano. You can see I've doubled some of the bits and pieces that are going on. I've turned up the velocity massively, so we get a much more clout to the bass. So let's hear this final section now. Let's layer all those parts. I think the thing that brings this all together is, yes, the arrangement, but also the attention that I've tried to play with dynamics. So if we just dive in, and it's not just dynamics here, we just dive in very quickly to, I want to say this is the viola part, quickly looking at it. I've got my modulation, my dynamics. I've also got a little bit of lift in expression. I've also got what here is called Control 14. Now, Control 14 for a lot of libraries is set to vibrato. So I'm mirroring the vibrato intensity on the dynamic intensity as well of this. So you'll kind of see what I mean. Probably the easiest way for you to see it is in a visual way, to be fair. So let's just pick at this and let's pull this up. So you can kind of see the graphs there, but if I bring this over from this side, if I press play, if you watch, we've got the dynamics here, but we've also got the vibrato as it plays. And that makes a real difference to realism as well. You'll often find, and sometimes it's hard if you don't play the instrument. I always wanted to be a string player, but I never was a string player. My son plays, he's still learning. But you'll see naturally players, whatever instrument you play, particularly when I play piano, there are particular notes, particular phrases that I will lean into or distinctively dig into the keyboard. And for me, I guess vibrato on a violin is like that. I'm kind of thinking from a piano player's perspective, when would I really lean and ping into a note to give it some life? For me, I kind of see that as being how, and a string player will probably comment on here and tell me I've got it completely wrong. But for me, how I work, that's kind of how I feel it works, is that vibrato wants to lean in and dig with you and bring the intensity and the emotion. And again, the panning makes a massive difference to hearing all of that come together. So essentially, in an overview, that's it. We've kind of talked about the harmony and the kind of 8-chord pattern that we had here. We've talked about the instrumentation, the piano double quartet, and how it's all set up and the different articulations. We've talked about the structure and how it's kind of mapped out in these slowly building sections. And we've talked about the subtle ways that the arrangement, not just chucking more layers on, but bits of the arrangement are changing and adapting. So it's not necessarily just more of the same to bring that. So I'm going to do another video at some point that dives into kind of, I mean, there's not a massive amount of looking at my kind of the mix console here in Cubase. There's not a massive amount of stuff particularly going on in terms of production, but rather than go into that now, because the video will become quite long, I'm going to do a separate video on how I went about doing the mix for this. And it'd be great if you could join me. I'll put the link to that in the description. I'll put a link to the original piece if you want to go hear the full thing and check out the rest of the album as well. Let me know what you think of it. Massive thanks again to Steve, and go look him up, Steve Matty-Carter. Put his details in the description, because without him, this collaboration and this co-writing wouldn't have happened, and we wouldn't have had these amazing pieces. I'm really grateful to have met him, and for all the time and stuff that he's given up, and conversations that we've had that have just furthered my own thinking and others. And I'll catch you on the next one.